Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I never thought I'd end up in a battle with my homeowners association. In fact, when I first moved into our cozy community, I believed the HOA was there to protect our property values and keep the neighborhood looking nice. I even appreciated that sense of order, until everything changed when my dad moved in with me. Dad is 83. He's still capable in many ways, but sometimes he has trouble remembering simple things. The doctor says it's mild dementia, and we're trying to help him stay as independent as possible for as long as we can. When his condition began to worsen, we both agreed it would be best for him to live with me. My house was plenty big, and I was excited to care for him in a stable environment. All was well for the first month. Dad loved sitting on the front porch, waving at neighbors. Some recognized him from his daily walks around the neighborhood. Everyone seemed welcoming, except for Karen Crisp, the HOA president. She's the type of person who organizes everything to a painstaking degree, whether or not it's warranted. One of Dad's first interactions with Karen set the tone for the trouble to come. That day, Dad was enjoying a glass of iced tea on the porch. I was inside cleaning when I heard what sounded like a polite conversation turning sour. I peeked through the front window and saw Karen standing on the walkway, arms crossed over her pastel sweater, scowling at him. Dad looked helpless, holding his iced tea like it might protect him from her scorn. I rushed outside. "Everything okay?" I asked. Karen didn't bother to hide her annoyance. "Your father is, well, he seems confused." I called out to him, but he didn't respond at first, and then he said something about the year 1975. She glared at me as if that explained it all. Dad still had a warm smile on his face. He offered Karen some iced tea, but she twisted her lips in disgust. I gently explained, "Dad sometimes gets dates mixed up, especially if he's talking about old memories. He's okay, though. Just let me know if he ever seems distressed." Karen gave a curt nod and turned to me. "I'm concerned. Does he wander? We have rules here about loitering or suspicious behavior. This is a family neighborhood, and we can't have," she paused. The rest of her sentence never came out, but I felt the sting. She clearly believed having an elderly person around was a liability of some sort. I tried to calm things down. "He doesn't wander far, but he does like to walk. If he ever seems lost, just call me. I appreciate your concern, Karen." She looked at Dad again. "I'll keep an eye on him." Then she strode off as if she'd been personally inconvenienced. That was only the beginning. Over the next couple of weeks, Karen periodically stopped me outside, pointing out trivial violations. She complained that the shrubs in front of my house were a fraction of an inch too high. Apparently, the HOA's landscaping guidelines are exact. I trimmed them the next day, but that didn't stop her from coming back to point out that my porch light was a different style than what the HOA recommended. At first, I tried to comply. I hated the way she seemed to hover, but I assumed it would be easier to meet her demands and avoid confrontation. Dad, of course, had no clue that anything was amiss. He'd walk around the block, greet whoever passed by, or sit on the porch singing old songs from his youth. Things took a turn when Dad started forgetting small items outside. Sometimes he'd water my plants and leave the hose out, or he'd place a small stool on the lawn so he could rest while gardening. Suddenly, I was receiving official HOA complaints in my mailbox: improper storage of yard equipment, personal belongings left in common view, and so on. But there was nothing in the HOA rules about a temporary stool, nor a hose that was still connected to the spigot. At that point, I started to suspect Karen was using any excuse to put my household on notice. My neighbors with kids had bikes strewn all over their yard sometimes, and I never saw official notices posted for them. When I tried to bring this up at an informal HOA meeting, Karen brushed me off. "We handle issues as they arise," she said. Still, I kept my head down, until one Saturday afternoon. Dad was a bit confused after a nap and walked out of the house, mumbling about having to buy eggs at the corner store. He wandered around the block. Usually, he came back after a few minutes, but he took a wrong turn. Concerned, I hopped in my car and drove around to find him. When I finally spotted him, there was a police cruiser parked next to him. Karen stood beside the officer, talking rapidly, her face red with indignation. Dad just looked confused. My heart plummeted. What in the world had happened? That was the beginning of our real trouble, an elderly father who'd lived in the neighborhood for barely 2 months, and now the police were involved because he took a wrong turn on foot. As I got out of my car and rushed over, I had no idea how complicated this was about to get. When I reached the scene, Dad was standing by the hood of the cruiser, looking both embarrassed and bewildered. Karen was rattling off something about trespassing, and the officer had his hands held up, trying to calm her. Immediately, I went to Dad and checked to make sure he was okay. His eyes lit up when he recognized me. Karen wasted no time. "Your father was in my backyard," she snapped. "He was poking around my back gate, and I have every reason to suspect criminal intent." Criminal intent? My dad can't even remember which day is trash day sometimes. The look of offense on Dad's face broke my heart. He mumbled an apology, something about how he thought he was at the walkway to our house. He must have gone down the wrong street. All the homes here look almost identical, and he ended up in Karen's backyard by mistake. The police officer, Officer Ramirez, held out his hand in a calming gesture. "Let's keep things civil," he said. "Your father wasn't harming anything. Ms. Crisp just got alarmed, that's all." I took a deep breath. "I'm sorry for the confusion. My dad has mild dementia, and he sometimes gets turned around. He meant no harm." Karen's eyes hardened as if she thought I was making it up. If he's confused, maybe he shouldn't be wandering around alone. People pay good money to live here and expect a certain standard of safety. My temper flared, but I kept my voice steady. Dad has every right to walk in this neighborhood. He's not a danger to anyone. It's an honest mistake. The officer nodded, seemingly sympathetic. No laws were broken here, and Ms. Crisp doesn't want to press formal charges. "I'd like the trespass documented," Karen interrupted. "I'm within my rights to ensure it's on record, so that if this happens again, there will be evidence of repeated incidents." Dad trembled slightly. "I'm sorry," he kept repeating, eyes downcast. "Didn't mean to trespass." The officer looked exasperated but asked for Dad's ID. I provided it while explaining more about his condition. Officer Ramirez seemed understanding, giving me a quiet nod. He then turned to Karen. "I'll file an incident note, but from what I see, it's just an honest mistake." Karen pursed her lips. "I want it on record. This won't be overlooked." I managed to walk Dad back to my car while the officer finished up. Karen and I exchanged no more words. Dad was silent on the drive home. I could feel his shame radiating from the passenger seat, and it crushed me. Back at the house, I got Dad settled and made him some tea, but he could barely sip it without apologizing again. "I'm causing trouble for you," he said softly. "Maybe I should move into a place, like a facility." My heart ached. "No, Dad. This is your home. We'll figure out how to manage." I tried to reassure him that everything would be okay, but the mood in our house changed that day. Dad became more anxious, worried he'd make a wrong turn again. He started second-guessing his daily walks, even though movement and a bit of independence were vital for his mental health. Meanwhile, I found an official letter in my mailbox from the HOA the next morning. The gist: Dad's incursion onto private property had caused community distress, and the board was requesting a special meeting to discuss preventative measures. My anger flared. The letter was obviously authored by Karen, but it had the official HOA letterhead. I decided I wasn't going to let this happen quietly. I called a few neighbors who had always been friendly with me. They were shocked to hear about how Karen called the police. Most of them said Dad was harmless, that they enjoyed chatting with him. But to my surprise, one neighbor quietly admitted that Karen had been complaining about Dad for weeks, telling people he was a menace and that he could easily wander into your backyard next. "She's stirring up fear," the neighbor told me apologetically. "I don't think anyone else really believes it, but you know how she is. She's strong-willed. Once she starts pushing a narrative, she'll do anything to get her way." The neighbor suggested I prepare for the worst. "I've heard talk of fines or requiring some sort of caretaker rule. Karen might try to argue that your dad can't be left unsupervised in the neighborhood." My stomach tightened. This was going too far. Dad is a grown man, albeit one with memory issues. But treating him like a criminal? Trying to ban him from walking freely in the place he's supposed to call home? The special HOA meeting was set for the following Thursday. In the meantime, Dad stayed mostly indoors, too anxious to walk around alone. I offered to walk with him, but he felt that was humiliating, like having a babysitter. So he stuck to the porch, occasionally humming a tune or flipping through old photo albums. Days dragged by. The more I read the HOA letter, the more furious I got. It wasn't even about the actual incident, it was about establishing guidelines for public safety, as if Dad's confusion was a threat that needed formal regulation. That Wednesday evening, a day before the special meeting, I heard a loud knock on my door. I opened it to find Karen Crisp, wearing that tight-lipped look I'd come to expect. She had a clipboard and some official-looking papers. "Good evening," she said primly. "I'm just here to inform you that at tomorrow's meeting, the board will propose an official vote that may restrict your father's unaccompanied access to the common areas. In other words, he may not be allowed to walk or sit in shared spaces unless he's supervised. I wanted you to be aware so you aren't blindsided." My heart pounded. "That's outrageous." Karen shrugged. "We have to protect the interests of all homeowners." She held out a folded piece of paper. "This is the specific bylaw in question, and I think you'll find we're within our rights. Have a nice evening." She turned and strode off, leaving me clutching the paper in disbelief. I watched her go, anger and fear boiling within me. Over my dead body would I let this happen without a fight? The special HOA meeting took place in the community clubhouse, a small but nicely decorated space typically used for potlucks or holiday parties. This time, the atmosphere felt cold, tense. A handful of residents showed up, most looking curious or uncomfortable. Karen perched at the front of the room behind a long table alongside 3 other board members. I tried to keep Dad at home so he wouldn't have to endure the stress, but he insisted on coming. "I need to speak for myself," he said. In truth, I wasn't sure if that was wise. He sometimes got flustered under pressure. Still, it was his right, so off we went. Karen opened the meeting with a forced smile. "Thank you all for attending this special session. We have one key agenda item, addressing concerns about potential safety risks posed by Mr. Patterson." She gestured to Dad like he was an exhibit in a court case. I clenched my jaw, but stayed quiet as she continued. "We've had a documented incident of trespassing, no matter how unintentional, and other neighbors have expressed worries about possible future incidents. It is this board's responsibility to ensure everyone's peace of mind. Tonight, we will consider and vote on a proposed amendment to our existing bylaws that would require residents with certain cognitive or behavioral issues to have supervision in shared spaces." She said residents with certain cognitive or behavioral issues so clinically, as though Dad were just a bullet point in a policy manual. My face burned. I turned to Dad, who was fiddling nervously with the edge of his jacket. One of the board members, a wiry man named Roger, cleared his throat. "We also want to clarify that this isn't personal, Mr. Patterson. We simply want to ensure that if anyone might get disoriented, they don't accidentally wander onto someone's property and cause alarm." My dad straightened, raising a trembling hand. "May I speak?" he asked. Karen offered a patronizing smile. "Of course, Mr. Patterson." Dad stood up, leaning slightly on the chair beside him. "I understand folks want to feel safe, but I'm not a danger to anyone. I served this country in the army, worked 30 years teaching high school, and raised a family." His voice wavered. "I love taking walks, it helps me stay healthy, both in body and mind. I got lost once, and Ms. Crisp called the police." He shook his head. "I apologized. I didn't damage anything, didn't threaten anyone." He took a small pause, drawing a breath. "I can't promise I won't ever get confused again. But is that a crime? Are we going to say that an old man can't sit in the park unless someone's holding his hand?" His eyes searched the room. A few people looked away, but I saw others nod in silent agreement. Karen cleared her throat. "Mr. Patterson, we understand this is frustrating. But we have a responsibility to the community. Our rules must protect homeowners from potential liabilities." Before she could continue, I stood up. "There are plenty of neighbors here who have known my dad, enjoyed his company. Let's not pretend he's a menace. This proposed bylaw is draconian, there's no other word for it. It's ageist, ableist, and just plain cruel. Murmurs spread through the room. Another resident, Ms. O'Leary, spoke up from the back. I've chatted with Mr. Patterson a few times. He's always been polite. I think what you're doing is an overreaction. Karen's lips thinned. We're simply following procedure. Is there a motion to vote on the proposed bylaw? Roger hesitantly raised a hand. I motion that we move forward and vote. Another board member seconded it, avoiding my gaze. All in favor? Karen asked. She and Roger, plus the other board member, raised their hands. One board member, a woman named Charlotte, hesitated, then slowly lifted her hand too. My heart sank as I realized the board was unanimous. Motion passes, Karen declared. Then she announced, we will have a formal community vote in 2 weeks, as required. If the majority of homeowners vote yes, the bylaw becomes official. I interjected, and if we want to challenge this? If we believe it violates my father's rights? Karen gave a tight, polite nod. You are, of course, welcome to seek any legal counsel you wish. But our bylaws are enforceable under state law. If the community votes in favor, compliance is mandatory. Dad gripped my arm for support. I glared at Karen. Fine, I said. Then we'll see you in court if we have to. Karen barely blinked. I hope it doesn't come to that. Meeting adjourned. She banged her gavel softly, as though we were in an actual courtroom. We left with our heads spinning. Outside, a few neighbors patted Dad on the shoulder, whispering that they were sorry. 1 or 2 said they'd vote against the measure, but it was too soon to know how the majority would sway. Karen had been fear-mongering for weeks, painting Dad as a potential lawsuit waiting to happen. I spent the rest of that evening poring over our HOA guidelines, searching for any legal foothold. My father has rights under the Fair Housing Act. There are protections against discrimination based on disability. Dementia is recognized as such. A kernel of hope ignited in my chest. Maybe we did have a fighting chance. The next morning, I contacted a local attorney, one specializing in elder law and housing disputes. After hearing my story, she sounded both concerned and intrigued. I've dealt with HOAs abusing power before, she said. They bank on residents not knowing their rights. But federal protections supersede local bylaws. If they pass something that effectively discriminates against people with disabilities, they could be in hot water. I felt a surge of relief. So we have a case. We might. Let's get more details and be prepared for the vote. If it passes, we'll file an injunction immediately. We'll see how the HOA responds. Hanging up, I told Dad the good news. He nodded, though worry still lined his face. Don't want to cause any trouble, he mumbled. Dad, I said softly, we're going to do whatever it takes to protect your dignity and your freedom to live here just like everyone else. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Thank you. Then his voice dropped. I hope they see reason before it gets that far. I wasn't so sure. This was Karen Crisp we were talking about. She didn't seem like the type to back down easily. The following 2 weeks felt like a roller coaster. The community buzzed with whispers about the upcoming vote. Karen Crisp went door to door, peddling her dire predictions. Imagine waking up to strangers in your backyard, or think of the liability if he has an accident on your property. She threw around the word lawsuit like it was guaranteed. On the other side, I rallied a handful of sympathetic neighbors. We printed flyers clarifying the legal realities, that restricting a disabled resident from common areas likely violated federal protections. We urged people to vote against the proposed bylaw and reminded them that being old or forgetful isn't a crime. Dad's only incident had been an innocent mistake, hardly justification for rewriting the neighborhood rules. The night of the vote arrived. The HOA set up a formal ballot process in the same clubhouse. Dad and I took our seats with a supportive neighbor, Ms. O'Leary. Karen sat at the front, behind a table stacked with ballots. She gave us a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Roger stood to address the group. We have a quorum, he announced. Each household may cast one vote regarding the proposed bylaw that would require a cognitively impaired resident to have supervision in shared spaces. The ballots will be collected and tallied. A simple majority will decide. My heart thundered as people lined up to vote. I saw some folks cast nervous glances at Karen, others at my dad, who sat quietly, hands folded. I could practically feel the tension. When it was my turn, I marked a decisive NO. Dad did the same. Then we stepped back and waited while everyone else finished. Karen and 2 other board members disappeared into a small office to count the votes. The hush in the clubhouse was palpable. People huddled in small clusters. A few offered us reassuring smiles or said they'd voted no. But how many had Karen swayed? At last, Karen emerged, her expression stony. Roger cleared his throat. The total votes in favor are 26. The total votes opposed are 34. The measure does not pass. A wave of relief washed over me. I squeezed Dad's hand, feeling the tension bleed out of my body. Ms. O'Leary and another neighbor patted him on the shoulder, whispering congratulations. Dad exhaled, his face a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. Karen tried to plaster on a neutral face, but I caught the flicker of frustration in her eyes. The motion fails, she announced. Therefore, no bylaw changes will be enacted. She looked like she had more to say but couldn't find the words. Finally, she forced a curt, "Meeting adjourned." It should have ended there. But as people started filtering out, Karen stopped me. Just because the bylaw didn't pass doesn't mean we won't be enforcing existing rules, she said, voice low. We'll continue to monitor your father's activities. We won't tolerate any further incidents. Then she spun on her heels and left. I felt anger surge through me again, but Dad put a hand on my arm. Let it go tonight, he said quietly. We won. That's enough for now. We walked to the parking lot, the crisp night air a welcome relief. Dad shuffled slowly, leaning on me more than usual. I assumed it was just the stress of the evening. Back home, I made him some warm milk. We sat in the living room in silence for a while, absorbing the night's events. They voted no, Dad, I said eventually, as if saying it again would make it sink in better. You can keep walking around. They can't enforce anything that discriminates against you. He nodded, eyes weary. I'm too old for this drama, kiddo, he teased gently. Next time, let's find a place without an HOA. We both shared a tired laugh. For a few days, life settled back into a semblance of normalcy. Dad resumed his porch sitting, though he still carried his phone with him on walks in case he got lost. Karen's glares persisted, and once or twice, I noticed her lurking behind the window of the HOA office near the clubhouse when Dad passed. But there were no new complaints, no new letters. Then, about a week later, Dad had a particularly rough day with his memory. I stepped out to pick up groceries, and he decided to walk down the street for fresh air. By the time I returned, I found a note taped to the door. We regret to inform you that the HOA has filed a complaint with local authorities regarding repeated trespassing. A hearing has been scheduled for next Tuesday in municipal court. My knees nearly buckled. No details, just a cold notice. Dad was napping on the couch, unaware of the storm that had just erupted. Furious, I dialed Officer Ramirez, who had responded the first time. He picked up, surprised to hear from me. As far as I know, there's no official police case open against your father, he said. That left only one possibility. Karen had gone to a magistrate or a code enforcement official on her own, twisting the incident note from before. There could be a hearing if she claimed Dad was a serial trespasser. I contacted my attorney. She was incensed. We'll get this thrown out, she promised. They're retaliating because they lost the vote. This is harassment. The next few days were a flurry of anxiety and preparation. Dad was distraught, and I was outraged. Finally, the hearing day arrived. My attorney and I walked into the small municipal courtroom, Dad at my side. And who should we see waiting there, looking smug and self-assured, but Karen Crisp, with a stack of papers in her arms. It all came down to what she claimed Dad had done, and how we could prove otherwise. Little did she know we had an ace up our sleeve. Ever since Dad's confusion incident, he'd been wearing a tracking device on his watch that recorded his route and location. That device would show exactly where he'd been. The hearing was about to begin, and Karen's eyes snapped to meet mine. There was no flinching in her gaze, just cold determination. I squared my shoulders and gripped Dad's hand. We'd fought the HOA in their own realm and won. Now, we'd stand before the law, and with luck, finally put an end to Karen Crisp's relentless campaign once and for all.